The last person I expected to see on Monday morning was the stranger from Saturday night. My coffee slipped from my fingers, splashing across the polished marble floor as the elevator doors opened. There he stood, perfect black suit, sharp jawline, cold gray eyes that looked as if they had never known warmth. The mysterious man who had spent one unforgettable evening talking with me until sunrise. The man whose name I never asked was now walking toward me while every employee lowered their heads in respect. "Good morning, Mr. Carter." "Mr. Carter? No, no way." My heartbeat thundered as realization hit me. The stranger I'd shared one impulsive, life-changing night with wasn't just any man. He was Ethan Carter, the billionaire CEO of Carter Global. And, starting today, he was my new boss. His expression didn't change even once. No surprise, no smile. Nothing. He walked past me as if we'd never met. I released the breath I'd been holding. Maybe he didn't recognize me. Maybe the dim lights, the crowded jazz bar, and too much emotion had blurred the memory for both of us. Good. That was better. Because I had promised myself that night would stay exactly where it belonged. In the past. 3 days earlier, life had fallen apart. My younger brother's medical bills had doubled overnight. The landlord had given me 7 days to pay overdue rent. My boyfriend of 4 years chose that exact afternoon to tell me he'd been secretly engaged to someone wealthier. "Love doesn't pay bills, Lily." Those were his final words before walking away. Broken people sometimes make unexpected decisions. Instead of crying at home, I wandered into a quiet jazz lounge downtown. I ordered one drink, then another. That's when a stranger asked if the seat beside me was taken. He wasn't flirtatious. He wasn't arrogant. He simply listened, for hours. He listened while I talked about my sick brother, my mother's death years earlier, the dreams I'd quietly buried, and how exhausted I was pretending everything was okay. When the bar closed, we walked through empty streets beneath city lights. No promises, no fake romance. Just two lonely people sharing a moment that neither expected. The next morning we woke up together. Neither of us believed in fairy tales. We smiled awkwardly, wished each other well, and walked in opposite directions without exchanging last names. I thought that chapter had ended forever. Apparently, it had just begun. At Carter Global, Ethan became someone completely different, cold, demanding, emotionless. He expected perfection. Employees feared him. Managers avoided making eye contact. Meetings felt like military inspections. Whenever he entered a room, conversations died instantly. Yet every time his eyes briefly met mine, something changed, just for a second. A softness appeared before disappearing again. I convinced myself I imagined it. Until one evening, everyone had already left. I stayed behind to finish preparing documents for an international charity partnership. As I gathered my things, the office lights suddenly dimmed. His voice came from behind. "You skipped lunch." I froze. Slowly turning around, I found Ethan standing in the doorway holding a paper bag. "I wasn't hungry." "You were." He placed the bag on my desk. "Your favorite sandwich, the exact one I'd ordered during our night together." My chest tightened. "You remembered?" "I remember everything." Silence filled the room, then he quietly added, "I never forgot you." The walls I'd built around my heart suddenly felt fragile, but I stepped backward. That night wasn't supposed to become anything. "I know, so why are you doing this?" He looked away toward the city skyline. "Because I've spent 3 days pretending you're a stranger. And it's impossible." From that day forward, little things began happening. Fresh coffee appeared before stressful meetings. Someone anonymously paid part of my brother's hospital expenses. Flowers arrived at my mother's grave every Sunday. No card, no signature. But I knew. When I confronted Ethan, he didn't deny it. "You needed help." I didn't ask. "You shouldn't have to." "I don't want pity." "It's not pity." "What is it?" His answer came almost instantly. "It's care." I wanted to stay angry. Instead, I cried. No one had quietly cared for me in years. Still, office gossip spread quickly. People assumed I was receiving special treatment. Some coworkers became distant. Others openly accused me of manipulating the CEO. Rather than defend myself, I requested a transfer. When Ethan heard, he approved it immediately. That hurt more than I expected. Maybe everyone had been right. Maybe our connection meant nothing after all. On my final day before transferring, I packed my desk in silence. As I reached the lobby, security alarms suddenly echoed through the building. Smoke filled the lower floors. Panic spread everywhere. Employees rushed toward emergency exits. In the chaos, an elderly janitor collapsed after inhaling smoke. Everyone kept running. Everyone except me. Without thinking, I turned back. I covered the old man's face with my jacket and helped pull him toward the exit. The smoke thickened. Breathing became painful. Just when I thought we wouldn't make it. Strong arms lifted both of us. Ethan, ignoring security officers shouting behind him, he carried the janitor over one shoulder while guiding me outside. The firefighters later confirmed the fire had been contained quickly. No lives were lost. The elderly janitor survived. As ambulances checked everyone, Ethan sat beside me on the curb. For the first time since I'd known him, the powerful billionaire looked terrified. You went back. He would have died. So could you? I smiled weakly. My mother always said if you can save someone, you don't ask whether it's convenient. He stared at me for a long moment, then quietly admitted, "That's exactly why I can't let you disappear from my life." Days later, the janitor visited my desk, carrying homemade cookies baked by his wife. With tears in his eyes, he thanked me for giving him more time with his grandchildren. The entire office watched. For the first time, people understood that kindness, not ambition, defined who I was. The rumors slowly disappeared. Respect replaced suspicion. Meanwhile, Ethan surprised everyone by announcing Carter Global would expand its employee family assistance program, covering emergency medical support, counseling, and education funds for workers in need. When reporters praised his leadership, he simply answered, "The idea came from someone who reminded me that success means nothing if you forget humanity." He never mentioned my name. He didn't need to. One quiet evening after work, Ethan found me volunteering at the Children's Hospital where my brother received treatment. I was reading stories to young patients. He stood silently outside the room for nearly an hour before finally walking in. The children immediately surrounded him, asking if the serious-looking businessman knew how to read fairy tales. To everyone's surprise, he sat beside me and began reading. The children laughed every time he struggled with funny character voices. It was the first genuine smile anyone at Carter Global had ever seen from their cold CEO. Watching those children laugh, I realized something unexpected. The powerful billionaire everyone feared wasn't heartless. He had simply forgotten how to be vulnerable. And somehow, one ordinary night, one unexpected meeting, and one simple act of kindness had started changing both our lives forever. The next morning, nothing between us returned to normal. Ethan still acted like the untouchable CEO in front of everyone. But the moment the office emptied, the distance between us disappeared. He found excuses to call me into his office. Not to discuss business, but to ask whether my brother was recovering, whether I had eaten dinner, or whether I was sleeping enough. Every question sounded cold, yet every action behind it was filled with quiet concern. I kept reminding myself that he was my boss, and that crossing the line again would only end in heartbreak. The harder I tried to stay away, the more he seemed determined to prove that I mattered. One rainy evening, my apartment building suddenly lost power after a storm. My brother's medical equipment stopped working, and I panicked. Before I could even call an ambulance, someone knocked on my door. Ethan stood there, completely soaked from the rain, carrying a portable emergency power supply. "How did you know?" I asked in disbelief. He admitted he had quietly arranged for security to check on my neighborhood after hearing about the blackout. My brother's equipment powered back on within seconds, and the crisis was avoided. Watching Ethan kneel beside my little brother, patiently making him laugh, despite the frightening situation, shattered the image of the cold billionaire the world believed he was. My brother smiled for the first time in weeks and whispered, "Is he your boyfriend?" My face turned bright red while Ethan simply smiled and replied, "Not yet." I quickly changed the subject, but his answer echoed inside my heart long after he left. Days later, Carter Global hosted its annual charity gala, and every employee was required to attend. I wore the only formal dress I owned, one my late mother had saved for special occasions. As I entered the ballroom, conversation stopped. Ethan looked at me from across the room, unable to hide the admiration in his eyes. Before he could walk over, his glamorous ex-fiancée, Victoria, arrived unexpectedly. Elegant, wealthy, and used to getting everything she wanted, she wrapped her arm around Ethan and loudly announced that they were considering getting back together. Cameras flashed while business partners applauded. I quietly stepped away, convinced I had misunderstood everything between us. Later that evening, Victoria cornered me near the balcony and warned me to stay away from Ethan. She claimed people like me only chased billionaires for money and that I would never belong in his world. Her words hurt because they echoed every insecurity I had tried to bury. Instead of arguing, I simply walked away. Ethan noticed my absence almost immediately. He searched the entire hotel until he found me standing alone outside beneath the city lights. "Why did you leave?" he asked. I forced a smile and replied, "Because your future walked into the ballroom wearing diamonds." Ethan looked confused before finally understanding. Without another word, he returned inside, walked straight to the stage, took the microphone, and interrupted the charity auction. In front of hundreds of guests, investors, reporters, and executives, he calmly announced that he and Victoria had ended their relationship years ago and would never reunite. Then, without revealing anything inappropriate, he looked directly at me and said, "The only woman I want in my future is the one whose kindness changed my life." The ballroom fell completely silent as every eye turned toward me. For a long moment, neither of us moved. The sounds of laughing children and cheerful music faded into the background as if the entire world had paused. Ethan slowly walked toward me, carrying the last box of toys in his hands. He looked different from the man I had known 6 months earlier. The expensive watches and designer suits were gone, replaced by a simple sweater and jeans. More importantly, the coldness in his eyes had disappeared. "Hi, Lily," he said softly. "Hi, Ethan." That was all either of us could manage before a group of children rushed over and begged us to help judge their drawing competition. We spent the afternoon together without talking about the past. We laughed at the children's funny artwork, handed out prizes, served food to elderly guests, and helped clean the park after the festival ended. Watching Ethan happily stack chairs, sweep the ground, and carry heavy tables shocked the volunteers who recognized him from business magazines. He never acted like a billionaire. He simply worked beside everyone else. As the sun began to set, the mayor announced that the fundraiser had collected far less money than needed to complete the hospital's new pediatric wing. The crowd fell silent, disappointed that many children would still have to travel hours for treatment. Without making a speech or seeking attention, Ethan quietly walked to the donation table and signed a check covering every remaining expense. Before anyone could applaud, he asked the mayor not to announce his contribution publicly. "If people remember today," he said, "I hope they remember the community that came together, not the man who wrote the biggest check." His words reminded me of the stranger I had met in the jazz bar, the man who listened more than he spoke. Later that evening, we sat on a quiet hill overlooking the town. The sky glowed orange as the last rays of sunlight disappeared beyond the mountains. Ethan finally broke the silence. "I spent 6 months trying to become someone worthy of loving you." I looked at him, surprised. He smiled sadly. "When you resigned, I realized I had been chasing success while ignoring the people who made life meaningful. You changed that." I admitted those months away had changed me too. I no longer wanted to hide from my feelings simply because life was complicated. Before either of us could say anything more, my brother came running across the hill with a small handmade kite he had built during the festival. He asked Ethan to help him fly it. Ethan laughed and took the string, running across the open field like an ordinary man, while my brother chased behind him, laughing louder than I had ever heard. I watched them together with tears filling my eyes, realizing that the lonely billionaire who had once hidden behind walls of ice had finally found a place where he could simply be himself. As darkness settled over the town and the colorful kite soared high into the evening sky, Ethan walked back toward me, gently took my hand, and whispered, "This time, if you choose to walk away, I'll respect it. But if you stay, I promise you'll never have to face life alone again." I looked down at our hands, my heart racing as memories of the past year rushed through my mind. The lonely night at the jazz bar, the shocking first morning at Carter Global, the rumors, the fire, the months apart, and now this quiet moment beneath a sky filled with stars. Slowly, I intertwined my fingers with his. I didn't need dramatic words. That simple gesture was enough. Ethan closed his eyes for a brief second, as if an enormous weight had finally lifted from his shoulders. My brother cheered so loudly that everyone in the nearby park turned to look at us, making both of us laugh. For the first time since we had met, there were no secrets, no misunderstandings, and no walls standing between us. Over the following weeks, Ethan visited our small town every weekend, instead of asking me to return to the city. Rather than convincing me to fit into his world, he quietly became part of mine. He helped repaint the community library, delivered groceries to elderly neighbors, volunteered at the children's hospital, and even joined local fundraising events without revealing his identity. The townspeople only knew him as Ethan, the friendly businessman who never refused to lend a hand. Watching him change wasn't the result of wealth or power. It came from genuine compassion. One afternoon, the hospital director announced heartbreaking news. The hospital had received more young patients than expected, and there were not enough beds to care for everyone. Families were being forced to travel hundreds of miles for treatment. Without hesitation, Ethan invited doctors, architects, and local leaders to a meeting. Instead of simply donating money, he listened carefully to nurses, parents, and volunteers about what the community truly needed. Within days, construction began on a new pediatric care center designed specifically for children from low-income families. He insisted that every room include play areas, family spaces, and libraries, because, as he said, healing required hope as much as medicine. During construction, Ethan worked alongside volunteers whenever his schedule allowed. Reporters eventually discovered the project and rushed to interview him, expecting another headline about a billionaire's generosity. Instead, Ethan stepped aside and introduced the nurses, teachers, construction workers, and volunteers who had sacrificed countless hours to make the hospital possible. "Heroes don't always wear expensive suits," he told the cameras. "Sometimes they wear scrubs, work boots, or carry library books." His interviews spread across the world, inspiring thousands of people to volunteer in their own communities. Months later, the new pediatric center officially opened. Families who once had nowhere to turn now had access to life-saving treatment close to home. Children filled the colorful hallways with laughter, paintings, and hopeful dreams. During the opening ceremony, my brother proudly cut the ribbon alongside Ethan, the mayor, and the hospital staff. Watching him smile with confidence after everything he had endured brought tears to my eyes. After the celebration ended, Ethan led me to the hospital's rooftop garden, where flowers bloomed beneath the evening sky. In the center stood a wooden bench with a small engraved plaque that simply read, "For every person who chose kindness when no one was watching." I quietly traced the words with my fingertips. "You built this?" I whispered. Ethan shook his head with a gentle smile. "No," he replied. "You did. You just didn't realize it. Every good thing that happened after we met began with your decision to help someone instead of walking away." Before I could answer, he reached into his jacket pocket and slowly revealed a small velvet box. My breath caught as he opened it, revealing a beautiful diamond ring that sparkled beneath the soft lights of the rooftop garden. Looking into my eyes with complete sincerity, he smiled and asked, "Lily, will you let me spend the rest of my life proving that one unforgettable night was actually the beginning of our forever?" Tears blurred my vision as I looked from the ring to Ethan's hopeful face. For a man who had negotiated billion-dollar deals without hesitation, he suddenly looked terrified of hearing one simple word. I smiled through my tears and whispered, "Yes." Before he could even slip the ring onto my finger, my brother burst through the rooftop door with several nurses and volunteers who had secretly followed us after noticing Ethan disappear. The moment they heard my answer, loud cheers echoed across the hospital rooftop. Ethan laughed, gently placed the ring on my finger, and pulled me into a warm embrace while cameras captured the happiest moment of our lives. News of our engagement spread quickly, but what surprised people most wasn't that one of the world's youngest billionaire CEOs was getting married. It was that the ceremony would not take place in a luxury hotel or private island. Instead, Ethan announced that we would hold our wedding in the garden of the children's hospital where our story had truly found its purpose. Every child receiving treatment was invited as an honored guest. The invitations requested that anyone planning to bring expensive gifts donate instead to children's hospitals or local charities. On the morning of the wedding, volunteers decorated the hospital garden with thousands of white flowers handmade by patients, nurses, teachers, and families. The children insisted on becoming flower girls and ring bearers, proudly walking down the aisle with huge smiles despite their medical treatments. When the music began, I walked toward Ethan wearing my late mother's restored wedding dress, carefully repaired by local volunteers as a surprise. Ethan's eyes filled with tears the moment he saw me. He later admitted that no business achievement had ever made him feel as rich as that single moment. After exchanging vows, we skipped the traditional luxury reception and spent the afternoon serving meals alongside doctors and nurses to every family staying at the hospital. Ethan greeted each child by name, remembering stories they had shared during his many visits. Watching the once cold and distant CEO kneel on the floor to build toy castles, read fairy tales, and laugh with children became the image newspapers around the world chose to publish instead of photos of expensive suits or corporate boardrooms. Years passed, but neither of us forgot where everything had begun. Carter Global continued growing into one of the world's most respected companies, not only because of its business success, but because every office encouraged employees to volunteer, support struggling coworkers, and invest in their local communities. The foundation expanded internationally, building schools, hospitals, libraries, and emergency shelters across countries where families needed hope the most. My brother recovered completely and eventually became a pediatric doctor, inspired by the people who had once saved his own life. Every year on the anniversary of the night we first met, Ethan and I quietly returned to the same little jazz lounge where two lonely strangers had shared a conversation that changed everything. We ordered the same drinks, sat at the same table, and smiled at the memory of how neither of us had known the other's name. One evening, as soft jazz filled the room, Ethan reached across the table and squeezed my hand exactly as he had on the hospital rooftop. "If I could relive my life," he said with a smile, "I'd still choose that night, that conversation, and you, every single time." I smiled back, realizing that what had begun as one unexpected night between two strangers had grown into a lifetime built not on wealth or power, but on trust, compassion, unwavering love, and the simple choice to never let each other go. 10 years later, the story that had begun with one unexpected night had become something neither Ethan nor I could have imagined. Carter Global was now recognized not only as one of the world's most successful companies, but also as one of its most compassionate. Every new employee learned the same lesson during orientation. people always came before profits. The company offered free health care for employees' families, scholarships for their children, paid volunteer programs, emergency housing assistance, and mental health support. Business schools around the world studied Ethan's leadership, but very few knew the real reason behind it. Every decision could be traced back to one lonely woman who had once chosen to help a stranger instead of asking what she would gain in return. Our hospital foundation had expanded across the United States, Canada, the United Kingdom, and dozens of other countries, opening children's centers, libraries, and family care homes where hope was needed most. I continued serving on the foundation's board while still spending time reading stories to young patients every week because I never wanted to lose touch with the reason everything had started. Ethan often joked that no board meeting was more important than story time with the children. We were blessed with a little daughter named Emma, whose kindness reminded me so much of my mother. Although she grew up surrounded by unimaginable wealth, Ethan insisted she learn the value of serving others before enjoying life's privileges. Every birthday she celebrated was spent delivering toys to hospitals instead of hosting extravagant parties. One snowy winter afternoon, Emma quietly disappeared during a charity event. Panic spread through the crowd as security searched every corner of the hospital. Ethan remained calm, but his eyes revealed the fear every parent understands. Minutes later, we found Emma sitting beside a frightened little boy who had just learned he would need emergency surgery. She had given him her favorite stuffed bear and was telling him that brave people were allowed to cry. Watching our daughter comfort someone she had never met brought tears to Ethan's eyes. He knelt beside her and hugged both children without saying a word. That evening, after Emma had fallen asleep, Ethan stood beside the window overlooking the city lights. "Do you know what makes me happiest?" he asked quietly. "It's not the company. It's not the awards. It's knowing our daughter already understands something it took me half my life to learn." I rested my head against his shoulder as we watched snowflakes drift across the skyline. Looking around our home filled with laughter, family photographs, and memories of countless lives touched through simple acts of compassion, I realized that the greatest miracle had never been meeting a billionaire CEO. The real miracle was watching two wounded hearts heal each other so completely that their love overflowed into the lives of thousands of strangers. And every time Ethan reached for my hand, he still smiled exactly the way he had the first night we met, as though he couldn't believe fate had given him a second chance with the woman he never intended to lose. 25 years passed in what felt like the blink of an eye. Emma had grown into a compassionate young doctor, following her uncle's path instead of taking a position inside Carter Global. Ethan secretly couldn't have been prouder. "The company can always find another CEO," he often said, "but the world will always need more people willing to heal others." Our son, Noah, inherited Ethan's sharp business mind, but also carried the gentle heart that had become our family's greatest legacy. Together, the siblings expanded the Carter Foundation into hundreds of communities, building hospitals, schools, libraries, emergency shelters, and scholarships that transformed countless lives. Yet, despite all the success surrounding us, Ethan never changed the habits that first made me fall in love with him. Every Friday morning, he still brought me coffee before I woke up. Every Sunday, we visited my mother's grave with fresh flowers. Every anniversary, we returned to the little jazz lounge, where two strangers unknowingly began a lifetime together. The owner had long since retired, but he left our favorite table untouched, calling it the table where destiny sat down for a drink. One autumn afternoon, Carter Global celebrated its 100th anniversary, with employees from around the world gathering at headquarters. During the ceremony, the board announced that a new leadership center would be named after Ethan. Everyone expected him to accept the honor. Instead, he walked to the podium, smiled warmly, and surprised the audience once again. "Buildings shouldn't be named after CEOs," he said. They should remind future leaders why they exist. He requested that the center instead be called the Lily Carter Institute for Compassionate Leadership. I was completely speechless. Looking at thousands of employees applauding, I shook my head with embarrassed laughter, but Ethan simply reached for my hand. Before Lily entered my life, he continued, I knew how to build companies. She taught me how to build people. Many executives wiped away tears. Young employees later admitted that speech changed the way they viewed success forever. That evening, after the celebration ended, Ethan and I slipped away from the crowd and walked through the quiet hospital garden where he had proposed decades earlier. The old wooden bench was still there, weathered by time but carefully preserved. The small plaque remained untouched, for every person who chose kindness when no one was watching. We sat together in comfortable silence as children laughed nearby, chasing butterflies through the flowers planted by volunteers years ago. Ethan gently leaned his head against mine and whispered with the same smile he had worn all those years ago. You know, people still think the best decision I ever made was growing Carter Global into a global empire. I laughed softly. Wasn't it? He slowly shook his head. No. He looked into my eyes with quiet certainty and said, the best decision I ever made was asking a lonely woman sitting alone in a jazz bar if the seat beside her was taken. I smiled, squeezed his hand, and together we watched another generation of children run through the garden that existed, because one unexpected night between two strangers had become a lifetime of love, hope, and endless second chances. 50 years after that unforgettable night, the city had changed, the skyline had grown taller, and Carter Global had become a name recognized across the world. But the one thing that never changed was Ethan reaching for my hand every morning before either of us got out of bed. Our hair had turned silver, our steps had slowed, and laughter came with more memories than plans. Yet every time he looked at me, I still saw the same man who had quietly listened to a broken stranger in a little jazz lounge. Emma was now leading one of the country's most respected children's hospitals. Noah had become CEO of Carter Global while protecting the company's values with the same determination as his father. And our grandchildren filled every family gathering with endless noise, questions, and laughter. They loved hearing the story of how Grandpa and Grandma met, although Ethan always left out the part about the one-night stand until they were old enough to understand that real love wasn't born from one night, but from every choice that came afterward. One spring afternoon, our family gathered to celebrate the opening of the Foundation's 1,000th community project, a children's learning center built in a neighborhood that had once struggled with poverty. Instead of delivering a speech, Ethan asked the organizers to invite several families whose lives had been changed through the foundation over the decades. Parents, teachers, doctors, nurses, volunteers, and former patients shared stories of hope, each one tracing back to a simple act of kindness that inspired another. Listening to those stories, I realized our lives had become connected to thousands of others in ways we could never have imagined. As the celebration ended, Ethan quietly slipped away from the crowd and drove me to the same jazz lounge where everything had begun. Time had transformed it into a historic landmark, and framed photographs covered the walls. In one corner hung an old picture of two young strangers laughing over untouched cups of coffee. We smiled at the memory. The owner, now retired but still visiting occasionally, recognized us immediately and insisted on serving our favorite drinks himself. We sat at our familiar table as soft jazz floated through the room, just as it had half a century earlier. Ethan reached into his coat pocket and surprised me with a folded piece of paper. It was the receipt from that very first night, carefully preserved all these years. You kept this? I asked, laughing through happy tears. I kept everything that reminded me of the day my life truly started, he replied. Outside, rain gently tapped against the windows exactly as it had the night we first met. Ethan looked at me with the same warmth that had never faded despite the passing decades. If I had walked into another bar that evening, he said softly. I would have made money, signed contracts, and built companies, but I would have missed the greatest adventure of my life. I rested my head on his shoulder as the music played around us. Neither of us needed to say anything else. The silence itself was filled with gratitude, love, and a lifetime of memories created because two strangers had once decided to share a conversation before saying goodbye, never realizing that fate had already written a far more beautiful beginning than either of them could have dreamed. Many years later, after celebrating nearly 60 years of marriage, Ethan and I returned one last time to the little jazz lounge that had quietly changed the course of our lives. The city lights shimmered outside the windows, just as they had on that unforgettable night, but now we sat together as two people who had shared a lifetime instead of a single evening. Our grandchildren had secretly reserved the entire place for us, filling it with family photographs taken over the decades. Our wedding in the hospital garden, Emma's graduation, Noah's first day as CEO, countless volunteer trips, birthdays spent with children in hospitals, quiet Sunday mornings, and thousands of ordinary moments that had become extraordinary simply because we experienced them together. The walls weren't decorated with awards or newspaper headlines about billion-dollar businesses. Instead, they were covered with smiling faces of people whose lives had crossed ours through kindness, compassion, and hope. One by one, former employees, doctors, nurses, volunteers, teachers, and families walked to the microphone, sharing stories about how a single opportunity, scholarship, hospital bed, encouraging conversation, or unexpected act of generosity had completely changed their lives. Many admitted they had gone on to help others because someone from Carter Global or the foundation had first believed in them. Listening quietly from our table, Ethan squeezed my hand exactly the way he had done thousands of times before. "Look around," he whispered. "This is our real success." I smiled, knowing he was right. Wealth had built buildings, but love had built people, families, and futures. As the evening came to an end, our children surprised us with one final gift. They played a restored recording from the security camera inside the old jazz lounge on the night we first met. The grainy black and white footage showed a young woman sitting alone, staring into her coffee, before a nervous young man walked over, smiled politely, and pointed toward the empty chair. There was no sound, but everyone already knew the first words. "Is this seat taken?" Laughter and tears filled the room as the video ended. Ethan turned toward me with the same gentle smile he had worn all those years ago. "You know," he said softly, "people always ask me what the greatest investment of my life was." I smiled because I already knew the answer. It wasn't Carter Global. It wasn't real estate. It wasn't the stock market. He lifted my hand and kissed it with quiet affection. It was taking a chance on one conversation with a stranger. I rested my forehead against his, surrounded by our children, grandchildren, friends, and the countless lives that had become part of our journey. Looking around the room, I realized that our story had never truly been about a billionaire CEO or a one-night stand. It had always been about two imperfect people who found each other at exactly the moment they needed hope the most and spent the rest of their lives proving that love is not measured by how unexpectedly it begins, but by how faithfully it is chosen every single day thereafter. The celebration ended long after midnight, but no one seemed eager to leave. Families lingered, children played between the tables, and soft jazz continued to drift through the room where our journey had begun so many decades earlier. Before everyone said goodbye, our eldest granddaughter stepped onto the small stage, holding a leather-bound journal. She smiled through tears and explained that over the past year she had secretly interviewed hundreds of people whose lives had been touched by our family. Doctors who had received scholarships, children who had survived because of the hospitals, employees whose families had been saved during difficult times, volunteers who had discovered a purpose, and strangers who had simply been inspired to show kindness after hearing our story had all contributed letters. The journal contained thousands of handwritten messages from around the world. She placed it gently into my hands and said, "Grandma and Grandpa, this is your real legacy." Ethan slowly opened the first page, and together we began reading message after message. Some were joyful, some heartbreaking, and many brought tears to everyone in the room. One former patient wrote that the hospital built through our foundation had given him a second chance at life. Years later, he had become a pediatric surgeon who now saved children every day. Another letter came from a single mother who had received emergency assistance from Carter Global after losing everything in a natural disaster. She wrote that one act of kindness had restored her faith in humanity. There were thousands more, each one proving that compassion always travels farther than anyone expects. Ethan quietly closed the journal and looked around the room filled with the people we loved most. "When I was young," he said with a gentle smile, "I believed success meant being remembered. Now I know the greatest success is helping others create stories even better than your own." Everyone stood and applauded, not because of his wealth or achievements, but because they knew the man speaking had lived those words every single day. As the final guests left, Ethan and I stepped outside the jazz lounge and walked slowly through the peaceful streets beneath a sky full of stars. The city was quiet, almost exactly as it had been on the night we first met. We stopped outside the entrance where a small bronze plaque had recently been installed. It read, "On this corner, two strangers met, and through kindness, changed countless lives." Ethan laughed softly. "I still can't believe you said yes." I smiled and replied, "I still can't believe I almost walked away forever." We stood there hand in hand, watching the lights reflect across the rain-soaked streets, grateful for every unexpected twist that had brought us together. Somewhere inside the lounge, the same old jazz melody began to play once again, carrying with it the memory of a chance encounter that became a lifetime of love. And as we slowly walked into the night together, surrounded by decades of cherished memories and the family we had built, it felt less like the ending of a story and more like two hearts continuing the same beautiful conversation they had started all those years ago with one simple question: "Is this seat taken?" A few months after that unforgettable anniversary, our family gathered once more. This time, not for a grand celebration, but for something much quieter. Emma had discovered an old storage room beneath the original Carter Global headquarters that was scheduled for renovation. Hidden inside were dozens of dusty boxes no one had opened in decades. Curious, our children and grandchildren carried them into the conference hall, where everyone sat together like excited kids opening forgotten treasures. Inside were old employee photographs, handwritten thank you cards, children's drawings from hospital visits, newspaper clippings, faded volunteer badges, and thousands of letters from people whose lives had crossed ours over the years. Then Noah found a small wooden box with my name written across the lid in Ethan's handwriting. Smiling, he handed it to me. I carefully opened it and found every little memory Ethan had quietly saved throughout our life together. The coffee receipt from the jazz lounge, the hospital visitor pass. From the day he first met my brother, the dried flower from our wedding bouquet. My old Carter Global employee badge that I had left behind when I resigned. The tiny paper star a child had folded for him during one of our first hospital visits, and even the library card I had carried while working in the small town where he found me again after 6 months apart. Tucked beneath them was a sealed envelope marked, "For Lily." Whenever you finally discover this box, my hands trembled as I opened the letter. It read, "If you're reading this, then our children have become curious enough to uncover all the little pieces of our journey. People will probably remember me as a businessman, but I hope you always remember me as the awkward stranger who asked if the seat beside you was taken. Every beautiful chapter of my life began because you were brave enough to answer yes. Thank you for giving a lonely man a home, a family, and a purpose far greater than success. If I had another 1,000 lifetimes, I'd spend every one searching for you, Tears rolled down my cheeks before I could finish reading. Looking around the room, I saw our children wiping away tears, our grandchildren hugging one another, and even longtime employees quietly smiling through watery eyes. Ethan wrapped his arm around my shoulders and laughed softly. I was hoping you'd find that after I had enough gray hair to hide my embarrassment. The room filled with warm laughter. Later that evening, as the sun set beyond the city's skyline, our entire family planted 12 young oak trees beside the children's hospital garden, one for each decade of the incredible journey we had shared together. As the youngest members of our family watered the tiny trees, Ethan squeezed my hand and looked at the growing line of future generations laughing beneath the evening sky. Neither of us needed to wonder what legacy we would leave behind. It wasn't the company, the fortune, or the buildings carrying our name. It was every heart that had learned to choose kindness, because two strangers had once believed that a single conversation could change a life, and then spent the rest of their years proving that it truly could. Years later, when Ethan and I had both grown old enough to walk slowly with canes in our hands, we returned once again to the place where everything had begun. The little jazz lounge had become a cherished landmark, its walls covered with photographs of volunteers, doctors, children, and employees whose lives had been connected through one unexpected story. The owner greeted us with the same warm smile and quietly led us to our favorite corner table. As we sat together listening to the familiar melody that had played on the night we first met, Ethan reached across the table and gently held my hand. "Do you ever regret answering me that night?" he asked with a playful smile. I laughed softly and shook my head. "Not for a single second," he smiled, his eyes still carrying the same warmth that had first made me feel safe all those years ago. We stayed there until sunset, talking about our children, our grandchildren, the hospitals, the libraries, the schools, and the countless beautiful people who had become part of our lives. Before leaving, we quietly signed the guest book one final time. Beneath our names, Ethan wrote, "The best decision I ever made was asking one simple question." Underneath his words, I added, "The best decision I ever made was saying yes." Hand in hand, we stepped outside and slowly walked through the peaceful streets where our journey had begun decades earlier. Across the road, a young woman sat alone on a bench, wiping away tears after what looked like a difficult day. A nervous young man carrying a cup of coffee hesitated for a moment before gathering the courage to walk toward her. Ethan and I exchanged knowing smiles, but said nothing. We simply watched as he politely asked if the empty seat beside her was taken. She looked at him, smiled through her tears, and nodded. As they began talking, Ethan squeezed my hand and whispered, "Looks like another beautiful story is about to begin." I rested my head against his shoulder, grateful for every unexpected twist that had brought us together all those years ago. We continued walking into the golden evening, surrounded by laughter echoing from nearby parks, children playing beneath the trees our family had planted, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that love, kindness, and hope never truly end. They simply continue through the lives they touch. Behind us, the soft jazz music drifted into the evening air one last time as the city lights slowly came alive, bringing our journey full circle. And just as our story had begun with two strangers sharing one unforgettable night, it ended with two soulmates still choosing each other after a lifetime, proving that the greatest love stories are not remembered because of how they start, but because they never stop growing until the very last page. Like, subscribe, and support my channel. I really need your support. If you enjoy my video, please share it and leave your feedback in the comments.